Horror on a Submarine. Poseidon-7. The Poseidon-7 submarine was the pride of the Navy. Her presentation was accompanied by loud speeches about a technological breakthrough. This metal giant was capable of reaching depths that had previously been considered inaccessible to humans. The boat could withstand the pressure at which most submarines would literally turn into cakes. Her mission was not only military but also scientific, exploring the depths of the ocean, new forms of life, and the possible use of marine resources. The team of 25 people was assembled from the best specialists of the fleet. Captain Gerard Hayes stood out among them. His calmness and professionalism inspired respect and trust. A man with 20 years of experience in the depths of the sea, he had seen a lot, but even he could not predict what lay ahead. The crew included engineers, biologists, and even psychology specialists to study how people behave in conditions of complete isolation at extreme depths. The atmosphere on board was upbeat. Everyone was full of enthusiasm and faith in the success of the mission. On the first day, the mission went perfectly. The boat sank to a depth of 3 kilometers. The crew worked smoothly, the instruments showed stable parameters, and the research began from the first hours. Dr. Rachel Manning, a biologist, collected the first water samples. "This is just incredible," she exclaimed, examining the data. "There is life here even at this depth. Bacteria that we've never seen before. We are on the threshold of something great." The captain smiled. "Very well, Doctor. Just don't forget to let us know if this life wants to eat us." Everyone laughed. No one knew how prophetic this joke was. On the third day of the mission, Poseidon-7 reached a depth of 7 kilometers, a zone where light does not exist and pressure destroys any weakness. The boat's searchlights illuminated the gloomy underwater world. The water around was thick as oil, and there were secrets hidden in its black depths that perhaps should have been left untouched. But no one knew about it then. The depth of the abyss. The third day of the mission passed quietly, but it was then that the team crossed the invisible border, beyond which uncharted waters began. The ocean seemed endless, empty, and silent, but the instruments recorded something completely different. Dr. Rachel Manning, absorbed in her analyses, looked at the results with surprise. "Captain, this is incredible," she said as she entered the control center. Hayes looked up from the monitors. "What is it, Doctor?" She unfolded the tablet, showing the data. "These microorganisms. We have never seen such structures before. It's not just bacteria. They have incredible resistance to extreme pressure, and they interact with other microorganisms at a level that we cannot understand. Maybe it's an entire ecosystem." "What does this mean for us?" asked the senior assistant, Liam Donovan. Rachel smiled, bowing her head slightly. "For us? Nothing yet. It's just a godsend. But if we investigate this..." Her voice trailed off as a low rumble, like a distant rumble, went through the boat. "What was that?" asked Technician Andrew Lowry, turning to the console. "It looks like it was a gas release from the depression," Liam replied. "A natural phenomenon." But this did not reassure the crew. The hum continued to sound like something was moving in the depths of the ocean, a turning point. At night, the team began to notice oddities. One of the junior engineers, Brent Wilson, complained of a headache. "Captain, this doesn't look like normal fatigue," he said, rubbing his temples. "Rest in your cabin," Hayes suggested. But a few hours later, the captain himself came to check on Wilson's condition. When he entered the cabin, he froze. Wilson was sitting on the bed, but his face was disfigured. He tore the skin on his forehead, leaving deep, bloody marks. "Wilson, what are you doing?" shouted Hayes, rushing towards him. The junior engineer looked up. His gaze was blank, as if he was looking through the captain, and then he started banging his head against the wall over and over again, with such force that the paneling began to be covered with bloodstains. Hayes dragged him away from the wall with difficulty. Wilson's face was covered in blood, and a faint smile appeared on his lips. "They're watching. They're waiting," he whispered before fainting. Dr. Manning came running with a first aid kit, but her face turned pale when she saw Wilson's condition. It's not just physical," she muttered. Further oddities. By morning, 3 other crew members began to show symptoms. They complained of itching, dizziness, and a strange feeling as if something was moving under the skin. Andrew Lowry, sitting in the engineering section, suddenly screamed and fell to the floor. When he was picked up, he tore out the nails on his right hand, leaving bloody marks on the control panel. "What's going on?" shouted Liam, trying to hold Lowry down. The captain ordered the infected to be isolated, but the space on the boat was limited. They locked them in one of the compartments, but it was unbearable to hear their screams. "They're calling us," Wilson whispered, the clawed scratches on his arms looking terrifying. Captain Hayes stood in front of the locked compartment and felt his confidence slipping away. "Doctor, what is it?" he asked. Rachel looked scared. "Captain, I do not know. I'm studying their blood. It's something alien. These organisms from the water penetrated into their bodies and began to affect the brain. But I don't understand how." Hayes gritted his teeth, looking at the dim light in the hallway. As it turned out, this was just the beginning of the chaos. The first victims. Captain Hayes stood in front of the locked compartment, listening intently to the sounds coming from inside. Screams. The walls of the boat seemed to tremble from the blows, which resounded with frightening regularity. "Captain, we have to do something," Liam Donovan spoke in a whisper, as if he was afraid that the infected might hear him through the metal door. "What is it, Liam?" Hayes shot a quick glance at the assistant. "We don't even know what kind of disease it is. Dr. Manning is working on it, but so far we don't have a cure or even an understanding." Liam stepped closer, his voice almost hysterical. "We can't keep them here. And where do you think we're going to put them?" "Overboard?" Hayes replied sharply, although inside he knew Liam was right. Meanwhile, Dr. Manning was still trying to understand the nature of the infection. She was sitting in the medical bay, examining blood samples from infected people. "These are microorganisms," she said when the captain entered the room. Her voice was low but strained. "They don't just infect the body. They change the chemical composition of the brain, making them behave like this. Aggressive. It's more than a virus. It's..." She stopped, not knowing how to finish the thought. "It's something alien," Hayes suggested. Manning nodded, her eyes filled with fear. "I do not know how to stop it." The first attack. The noise in the locked compartment suddenly stopped. This silence was unnatural, oppressive, as if the boat was holding its breath. "They fell silent," Liam whispered. The captain, alert, approached the door. "They're probably just tired," he suggested, although he didn't believe it himself. But before anyone could say anything else, there was a deafening bang from outside the door. Then another one. The metal buckled under the strong pressure. "They're breaking down the door," shouted Liam, grabbing the nearest metal bar. "Everyone back up," ordered Hayes. The door broke off its hinges, and the infected burst into the corridor. They were no longer people. Their faces were distorted with pain and rage, and the skin in some areas was stripped to the flesh. One of them, Engineer Andrew Lowry, shouted something incomprehensible. His voice was hoarse and insane. The first victim was Senior Engineer Marcus Vanson. The infected man rushed at him with a wild roar, knocked him to the floor, and began to tear his face. Blood splattered on the walls. "Run!" shouted Hayes. The team rushed in different directions, each trying to find shelter. Life in hiding. The survivors gathered in the central compartment. There were only 10 of them, including the captain. The rest either became infected or died in the chaos. "We have to surface," Liam said, breathing heavily. "We can't stay at this depth anymore." "So what? If we rise too fast, the boat will not withstand the pressure. We're all going to die," Hayes countered. "We're already dying here." The situation was heating up. The infected continued to prowl the boat, breaking down doors and walls. Their screams and blows grew louder as the survivors tried to hold the last barrier between themselves and this hell. "How much time do we have, Doctor?" Hayes asked Manning, who looked completely exhausted. "I don't know," she whispered. "But it seems that organisms don't need air. They are adapted to survive in such conditions. We don't." A dark awareness. The captain looked at his men. Each of them understood that there was practically no hope left. And yet they continued to fight, strengthening the doors, building barricades of furniture. When the infected broke into the compartment again, a new nightmare began. One of the survivors, Technician Jared, suddenly lost consciousness. His body began to writhe in convulsions, and in front of their eyes, he turned into one of them. His eyes rolled back, and an inhuman roar came out of his mouth. "We can't go on like this," shouted Liam as the team retreated deeper into the compartment. "Then find a way out," the captain said firmly. Terror in a confined space. The corridors of Poseidon-7 have become a real trap. The dim red emergency light cast long, distorted shadows. The infected wandered around the boat. Their movements were chaotic, and their moans and screams echoed along the metal walls. The survivors locked themselves in the last compartment, the main engineering section. The barricades of boxes, furniture, and equipment looked like a pathetic obstacle for those who no longer knew fear or pain. "We won't last long," Dr. Manning whispered, sitting down on the floor. Her hands were shaking, and she was clutching a journal with notes of her observations. Captain Hayes looked at the remaining crew members. Their faces were covered with abrasions and oil stains. Everyone's eyes reflected despair. "We have to hold out," he said firmly, hiding his excitement. Liam, who was standing at the entrance with a metal pipe in his hands, turned around nervously. "Do you hear that?" The sounds of footsteps were getting closer. They were uneven, as if someone was limping badly. Then there was a thud, as if something hard was scratching the metal floor. "They're close," one of the engineers, Greg, whispered, clutching a monkey wrench. Loss of control. Suddenly, a bang on the door made everyone jump. The barricade trembled as if it had been forcefully pushed. The infected were here. "Hold the door!" shouted Hayes, rushing to the barricade. The remaining crew members rushed to the door, trying to hold it down. But the blows were getting stronger. The metal hinges began to grind, as if unable to withstand the pressure. And then it happened. One of the crew members, a technician named Kyle, suddenly stepped back from the door. His eyes rolled back and his body began to convulse. "No!" "Not him!" shouted Liam, stepping back. Kyle fell to his knees, his hands began to twitch convulsively, and a scream escaped from his mouth, turning into an animal roar. Then he abruptly got to his feet, his movements becoming unnaturally abrupt. "Kyle, it's me, Greg!" The engineer tried to stop him, but Kyle lunged at him, knocking him down. Hayes rushed towards them, grabbing a monkey wrench, and hit the infected man with all his might. Kyle collapsed to the floor, but his roar echoed through the compartment. "Greg, get up!" the captain shouted, but it was too late. Greg was lying on the floor, and the infected who broke through the barricade broke into the room. "Escape!" Hayes shouted, grabbing Manning's arm. Liam and two other survivors rushed after the captain, leaving Greg and the others to be torn apart. The screams coming from the compartments behind merged with the sound of footsteps echoing through the corridors. "Where are we going?" shouted Liam, barely keeping up with the captain. "To the central control room," Hayes replied without turning around. When they reached the control room, Hayes slammed the door and locked it. Manning fell to the floor, breathing heavily. "We can't run anymore, Captain," she said. He looked at her and saw the fear in her eyes. She was right, but they had to try. "We have to get to the surface," Hayes said firmly. "The last plan." The captain opened the control log and began to record everything that happened. He knew they were trapped, but if someone found the boat, he wanted the world to know what happened to them. "Doctor, what are our chances?" "What is it?" he asked without looking up from his notes. Manning was silent. Then she quietly replied, "None." Liam went to the window, looking at the fading lights of the appliances. "If this is the end, then I hope they never find us." Hayes closed the magazine. "They will find it, and they will have to understand that not everything on this planet belongs to man." There were screams outside. The infected made their way to them. The last entry, the central control post, the heart of Poseidon-7, has now become the last stronghold of those who have not yet fallen victim to a strange and terrifying virus. The metal door buzzed with blows, losing its strength every moment. Hayes, Manning, Liam, and the two survivors knew their time was running out. Captain Gerard Hayes sat at the main console, his face shadowed by the faint emergency light. There was a magazine in front of him, the last pages of their tragedy. "Captain, this is pointless," Liam said, pacing back and forth nervously. "No one will find us at this depth. These recordings won't change anything." Hayes looked up, his eyes steady. "If they don't find us, then these pages will tell our story. People need to know what we're up against. They need to know so that they will never repeat our mistake again." Dr. Manning was sitting on the floor, her hands shaking. She was still clutching the blood tests, as if she was trying to make some sense of everything that was happening. "These are microorganisms," she began in a whisper, as if she were talking to herself. "They enter us through the water. They're adapting. They are changing us, but not for survival. They turn us into—" She couldn't finish. Liam came up to her, trying to cheer her up, but his gaze constantly wandered to the door, behind which the rumbling grew louder. "How much time do we have?" "What is it?" he asked, not expecting an answer. The captain, without looking up from the magazine, said, "Just as long as it takes for them to get inside. Last chance." As the blows on the door became deafening, Hayes took one last look at his men. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice sounding firm as at the beginning of the mission. "We can't beat this, but we can try to warn the world. They should know that the depths of the ocean hide something that we can't handle." He closed the magazine, putting a pen in it. If someone finds us, they'll find out what happened, and they will learn that humanity should not go where it has no power. Liam looked at the captain. And what should we do now? The door began to grind. The first loop couldn't stand it and broke off with a bang. Now we're getting ready for a fight, Hayes said. Fall. The door shattered and the infected rushed inside. Their faces were distorted, their bodies disfigured by themselves. They were no longer human. Hayes and the others fought desperately. Liam, armed with a metal pipe, fought back with all his might until one of the infected knocked him to the floor. Screams echoed through the compartment. Dr. Manning tried to defend herself, screaming, but one of the creatures grabbed her by the throat. Hayes rushed to help, but his strength was insufficient. The infected have absorbed them. Effects. Years later, an underwater research mission discovered the wreckage of Poseidon-7 on the ocean floor. The hull of the boat was covered with a strange organic material resembling corals, but not amenable to analysis. The remains of the crew were found, but the most eerie find was Captain Gerard Hayes's magazine, miraculously preserved. The recordings told a story that became a terrible warning to humanity. The words of the last entry were written in a firm handwriting. Do not look deeper. We found it, and we paid too high a price.